one of the things I commonly see, for example, in cannabis users is that, cannabis is this miracle drug for them. It helps them sleep, it relaxes them, it makes them, more creative, although I must say they feel more creative. Whether they're actually creating is in question. And then over time, what they'll report is that it stops working as well. They need more and more to get the same effect. And then ultimately it turns on them. And this is really fascinating because what it means is that the brain has thoroughly learned and adapted to that drug such that after a while, it doesn't tip the balance at all to the side of pleasure. But as soon as it's introduced, slam, the balance will go down to the side of pain. Those neuroadaptation gremlins that our brain creates to restore balance don't go away, right? They're like waiting in the wings, ready to hop on. And as soon as we use, they tilt us. So that's why.
All right, guys, in today's video, we're going to be reacting to a series of podcasts that we're featuring Dr. Ann Lembke, and she is the guru right now when it comes to addiction and dopamine production. And I have been absolutely obsessed watching her videos on YouTube, and specifically her videos discussing cannabis addiction. She also happens to be the author of a book, Dopamine Nation, which I would highly recommend that anyone struggling with addiction to cannabis reads, because wow, this book is changing how I live my life day to day with each chapter that I've gotten through. I have linked all these original podcast videos in the video description, as well as a link to her book, Dopamine Nation. So without further ado, let's jump into some clips from some various different podcasts and listen to what Dr. Lembke has to say regarding cannabis addiction. The first one is going to be a conversation between her and Tom Bilyeu from Impact Theory YouTube channel, and let's hear what they have to say about cannabis.
In my clinical practice, it takes a minimum of a month abstaining for that to happen.
I was very impressed you got that teenage girl to cut out marijuana for a month. I was like, all right, how's she going to pull this off?
Right.
Okay, so right there, I'm just going to pause real quick. They were already mid-conversation in this clip, and what Dr. Lembke is stating is that it takes about a month for dopamine production to return back to a normal state minimally when it comes to quitting an addiction. And I think this is so powerful because throughout my active addiction, if someone had told me, Frank, you can start to reverse the last 9 years of suffering in a 30-day period, oh my gosh, that would have meant the world to me to hear something like that, because I know when you're going through the withdrawals, when you're going through the physical pain, it feels like it's never going to end. And I think just having an idea of a timeline and some degree of expectation, we can start to feel better when we're actually going through those physical withdrawals.
Yeah, and it's hard to do because, the sensation is that I'm depressed and anxious, and that's why I'm using, because it relieves it. And what we're not able to see is the true cause and effect of, because I'm using this substance repeatedly and bombarding my, dopamine reward pathway, that is why I'm depressed and anxious.
We talk about this all the time on my channel when it comes to depression and anxiety. So many people will come on and say, and I was under the same impression that weed is helping with the depression, that it's helping with the anxiety. And what I tell people is once we cross over to addiction, the only depression and anxiety that weed is relieving is the depression and anxiety that's resulting from the consequences of having an addiction. So maybe we have a financial impact. There's been negative impacts on our relationships, negative impacts on our health, and we become depressed and anxious over those negative outcomes of addiction. We smoke weed, and temporarily we feel this relief from that depression and anxiety. But in all reality, weed and addiction may have been playing a large role in the cause of that depression and anxiety. It's like someone who smokes a cigarette and says it gives stress relief. The only stress it's relieving was the stress created by the nicotine craving. So this is where we're taking the mindset shift of seeing something that was once a solution as actually the cause of our problems. And the solution to our problems cannot be the same thing that's causing them.
And that's the thing, that we're just that cause and effect loop. we're not good at seeing. But, she was willing to take that leap of faith to stop smoking cannabis for a month. And ultimately what she discovered, and this is really the beauty of this intervention, is that she herself gathered data and realized, first of all, she realized in the first 2 weeks she felt horrific, vomiting, and she realized that was her realization. Oh my goodness, I was really addicted. Like I hadn't realized I was, but that physiologic response when she stopped was a wake-up call for her. And then when she got to 4 weeks.
And you quit a drug. All the things that you go through when it comes to withdrawals, these were all things that drug was doing to your body, the damage that it was causing. These withdrawals are a direct result of that substance use, in this case, cannabis. And I know for me, it was eye-opening. When I was sitting there going through the nausea, going through the paranoia and manic behavior, when I was going through all that, I couldn't believe what I was experiencing. And that was a really powerful motivator for me going forward to not wanting to return to cannabis use. And I love Dr. Lembke's approach, and we take a similar approach here at Addiction Mindset Recovery Coaching. This is giving the person the opportunity to realize this for themselves, observing for themselves firsthand, and then making a choice on their own to either cease use or change their relationship with the drug, as compared to me sitting here telling someone, don't smoke weed, don't use nicotine, don't watch adult media content. Because if it's not your choice, your experience, the quitting process is almost impossible and usually always unsuccessful.
She just felt so much better, less depression, less anxiety, more time to do other things, more enjoyment in other things, because of course with addiction our focus narrows on that one thing. And then she herself was motivated. Now, did she want to continue to abstain from cannabis? No, she didn't. Most of my patients don't. But she wanted to use really differently than she had before. She wanted to have a different relationship with cannabis. She certainly wanted to use less.
I just want to say something really quick. A lot of people that we work with here, once they've hit that 30-day mark, that 6-month mark, a lot of people do decide that they don't want to use cannabis anymore. And the reason why I say that is in our recovery coaching programs, we really work with people and kind of push people in their sobriety to start to build a new or better life for themselves. And once you get a taste of that new version of you, many people will say, well, I don't want to go back to that old version of me that fell into addiction. But each to their own, each to their own.
She certainly didn't want to use every day, because there is something important about that 24-hour cycle. And if we're sort of pinging our reward pathway every single day, we're more likely to accumulate those gremlins on the pain side of the balance and to develop tolerance.
So what she's talking about, the gremlins on the pain side, Dr. Lembke explains very well that when you use a drug, your brain releases a lot of dopamine, and you imagine like a teeter saw. So you use the drug and that saw tips towards the side of pleasure, but your brain has to balance out that pleasure by creating pain to try and recreate balance. And she states that when we are stuck in an active addiction, yes, we're getting this pleasure, but then our brain overcompensates, creating more pain than pleasure on the downfall. That's why here at my offices, we always preach addiction doesn't create higher highs, it only creates lower lows. And Dr. Lembke has now explained why that is, why that occurs. So use of the drug only creates more pain because of the physiological changes that occur in our dopamine pathways when we're suffering from active addiction.
What is it about weed? People be smoking weed.
Yeah.
Like, it is crazy. There are people in my own life that be smoking weed.
Okay.
And is it the sort of perceived harmlessness, or is there like, whatever people get out of weed, I don't get. Mm-hmm. I will say the one caveat is sex on weed is crazy. Like when you first do it, and of course, even though I rarely do it, I find that it does diminish over time.
Yeah.
But why weed? What's going on?
Well, I mean, so as with all intoxicants, they mimic a chemical that our brain makes, and our brain makes a version of cannabis that binds to the anandamide receptor, and weed is essentially a super potent form of a chemical that our brain makes anyway. And if you look at the evolution of weed over the past 30 to 50 years, it's slowly been made much more potent. So, our grandparents' weed is not our kids' weed, right? It's gone from really a soft drug to a hard drug, which also makes it more addictive. If you look at the sort of things that make something addictive.
Is that considered controversial? Because for a long time, people were like, come on, you can't get addicted to weed. Not so sure.
I guess it is probably still controversial. It's not at all controversial for me because I would say about a third of my clinical practice is people coming in and wanting help for a cannabis addiction.
Whoa.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
a majority of people who work with my offices almost exclusively are calling us for THC addiction. And typically, if I'm working with a male, adult media content addiction seems to go hand in hand. And I know that was certainly the case for myself.
and I'm in Northern California. Cannabis is medicine. And a lot of people end up addicted. The data show that about 9 to 10% of people who use weed will end up addicted to weed, but that's probably an underestimate, especially given the rising rates of daily cannabis use. The other thing about cannabis is not only was it less potent in the 1960s and 70s, but people tended to be weekend recreational users with friends. What the data show now is that many, many more people are using daily. They're using all day long, and they're using a highly potent form. So it's essentially like smoking a pack of cigarettes. People wake up, they start smoking, they smoke all through the day, and then they start again the next day. And there are more and more weed users like that than there used to be a generation or two ago.
Yeah, it's really like even when
I think a lot of that developed with the introduction of the THC cartridges and the ease of access to smoking now. You can rip a cartridge and it barely even smells. And I know from talking to people in my own personal experience, this definitely accelerated my addiction to cannabis.
I was a kid, it was like, I remember seeing weed for the first time and freaking out. I was like, yo, like that might as well have been heroin. I was like really sketched out by it. And I was like, okay, I need to get away from this. And admittedly, I grew up with a mother who was just beating us about the head, neck, and chest about staying away from drugs. And if somebody, like she used to quiz us, if somebody offers drugs, what do you do? Where do you go?
Sounds like me.
Yeah, that's great. Certainly worked. Neither my sister or I use any drugs. And
it's funny. I grew up in the same family environment. Don't use drugs. And all I can say is this. I think there was a large part of me that actually wanted to use drugs more because of that, the defiance type of thing. Someone's telling me not to, so I want to do it even more. And when it came to quitting for myself, I had to recognize that I wasn't quitting for anyone else, but I was making my own choice to quit, and that I wasn't forcing myself to quit, because if it had felt like I was forcing myself to quit, I naturally would then even want to defy my own rules that I put forth for myself. So just a caveat.
And now it's like really popular, and I don't have a beef with it. If like people have a healthy, this is a weird word to use when talking about drugs, but if they have a relationship with it that isn't detracting from the rest of their life, cool, no moral judgments whatsoever. But it is interesting to me from like an anthropological standpoint to watch how it has changed in culture to go from this thing that only potheads, which used to be a super derogatory term, would use, to now it's like you almost have to do it to be cool.
Right. And the other thing, very important, I mean, cannabis has become medicine, right? I mean, and there is clearly short-term medical utility. I will say, though, that the studies showing medicinal benefit, whether it's for seizure spasticity or for pain or for, other indications, are really short-term studies. We do not have good long-term studies showing long-term benefit, especially when used daily. But
I think another thing on that too is, from my understanding, a lot of the studies revolving around cannabis actually play a role in the other endocannabinoids, or phytocannabinoids, I should say, found within the cannabis plant. So we're talking about CBD, CBG, CBN. Yes, there's medical benefit to THC, of course, but from what I've read, a lot of the medicinal benefit isn't actually coming from THC, but rather the other phytocannabinoids, which is fascinating because a lot of those other phytocannabinoids don't result in a high. So very interesting when we're talking about weed as medicine. It also makes it that much harder to quit when someone is using a drug medicinally, because now we have to address the factors of, well, how are we going to control pain? How are we going to work on the insomnia? What are we going to do for the anxiety? Those factors certainly need to be addressed in sobriety.
People have this notion that cannabis is very safe and that it's not addictive. And we do know, from studies out of NIDA that the more people associate something as being medicinal, the less likely they are to be concerned about the dangers or the harms. So,
is there studies coming out that show dangers and harms?
Oh, yeah, of course. I mean, especially again with long-term use. First of all, smoking anything is bad for you, right? So certainly lung damage is huge. And most people who use cannabis, whether recreationally or medicinally, smoke it. Most people are not, doing edibles. There are people who do edibles, people do it in combination, but most people smoke it. And there are a lot of potential downsides associated, again, especially with daily long-term cannabis use, not the least of which is the potential of becoming addicted.
I think addiction is potentially the worst side effect of any drug. And if you're watching this video, I think right now you could think of some instances in your life where your life is being negatively impacted by the consequences of addiction. Now we're going to jump into another podcast and listen to a little bit more about what Dr. Lembke has to say about cannabis use.
Stimulus. So if the initial stimulus is pleasure, there's a price to pay for that, which is this transient experience of pain before the balance goes back to baseline. Another important rule governing this balance is that with repeated exposure to the same or similar stimulus, that initial response to the side of pleasure gets shorter and weaker, but the after response to the side of pain gets stronger and longer. So if we use the same drug over and over again, after a period of time, we will get less pleasure from it. But the price that we pay, the after effect, the come down, gets longer and stronger. And this is why repeated exposure ultimately kind of drives us into this chronic dopamine deficit state where...
So this is where Dr. Lembke is discussing dopamine deficit, so a decrease in dopamine production with chronic drug use. And when we're in a dopamine deficit state, that can lead to feelings of anhedonia, which I've made other videos on this channel talking about anhedonia and cannabis use, which is essentially a just all-around lack of joy that we experience in our lives. Nothing gives us pleasure, nothing brings us joy. And what she's referencing here is when we abuse a drug, the consequences, the pain and the suffering, as our brain tries to counteract that pleasure that we experience, eventually greatly outweighs the pleasure, as we kind of hinted at earlier in our discussion.
Nothing else is enjoyable, where our focus narrows to our drug of choice, and that's the only thing that we look forward to. And then, importantly, tolerance develops, meaning that we need more of that drug quantity-wise, or more potent forms of that drug in order to get the same effect or in order for it to just work at all.
And the sad thing is the effect that we're chasing is our next low point, not our next high.
Now when I use cannabis, I get paranoid, I get anxious. It does the opposite. It makes me vomit, the opposite of what it used to do. And that, you can find for a lot of different drugs. Opioids used chronically can actually make physical pain worse. We're seeing this here, especially with chronic pain patients. Any of our drugs of choice, if we really think about them, we can ask ourselves, am I really even enjoying doing this anymore? I'm like caught in it. It's hard to stop, but I'm not sure I even like it anymore, which is why, again, dopamine is so central to this, like wanting something, even when we don't necessarily like that thing.
Guys, be sure to check out Dr. Lembke's book and these full podcasts in the video description. I put all the links there. If you're sick and tired of continuing to do something that you don't want to be doing anymore, which is essentially the cycle of addiction, and you want help breaking that cycle, check out the pinned comment for our community support group, one-on-one coaching through our offices to help you quit using cannabis, or the free 7-step guide that I created to help you begin your quitting journey. Or follow me right into the next video where I talk about anhedonia and cannabis use. I'll see you guys in one of those areas that I just listed off. Until next time.